Started. I'm already back into BricsCAD, and we'll just start a new drawing with the BIM MM template. And the first thing that we're going to do is create a grid. So from the quad under model, you'll see this rectangular grid. And once you start to draw your grid, notice that we've got 4 different boxes here, and I can tab between the boxes to give the dimension. So here is our overall. We have 2 overalls and then two grid spacings. So we're going to have a grid that's 20,000 millimeters by 35,000. And we can leave our grid spacing at 5,000 by 5,000. But in the future, if you want, this is where you would go to change your grid spacing. Once we place that, we can see that we've got our labels automatically created. Next, we're going to create a slab that's going to be under the grid. So to create our slab, we can just draw a box. Now this is important. You want your slab to be bigger than the grid. So we'll go outside of the grid lines. And also, whoops, that's not what I wanted. Also, when you draw that box, you're going to come down. So your thickness of your slab is below the grid because you want that slab to be below the grid. And that thickness is 500. So we can see how the grid is on top of the slab, and that's going to be important as we work through this. So we've got our grid, we've got our slab. The next thing is to add some steel, and we'll do that from our BIM profiles. And again, the profiles looks like a little I-beam. If you're not seeing that, right click to go to panels, and then you'll see BIM profiles. So that should be on. Within the profiles panel, you can filter what profiles you want to see. We have HVAC, we have piping. We're going to work with structural steel. There are multiple standards as well. We're working in the Euro standard, and even from there, we'll go into I-shapes, and we can even continue to filter in that as well. But this will give you a list of different shapes and sizes. And we're going to start by placing 1. Now, it is important that your snaps are on. We want to be able to snap to the intersection of the grid line, so make sure that that is on. And also, let's turn ortho on. Ortho or polar, but either one should work. So we do want the Euro HEA 300. Now, once I drag this into my drawing, you'll see that that shape is attached to my cursor. So we're going to place it at the intersection of the 2 column lines. And then as I draw up, you'll see we can start to see the shape. Now, at this point, before I give it a height, this is where I can change the orientation of my profile. And we can change it by a 1/4 turn by typing Q. And you'll see now how that's rotated for me. And that's the way we want it. This is the orientation that we want. Now that we've got the correct orientation, we can type in our height, which will be 5,000. So we have, and then just hit enter again. So there's our steel. And we could take this and we could copy it. We could maybe even do an array to place the steel at the intersection of all the grid lines. Instead, we're going to use Propagate. And we saw a little bit of Propagate with Kin's presentation when we were propagating the details. But you don't have to have just a detail to propagate. You can propagate anything. And basically, what's pretty cool about Propagate is that there are several different kinds of Propagate, but you don't really have to know which one you want to use. BricsCAD will figure out which version of Propagate works for you. But the couple of things to keep in mind are there are reference solids and detail solids. And again, we saw that when we were creating the detail with Kin. Your reference solids are going to be what defines the relationship of the detail. So kind of what's my base point? What am I looking for? And then my detail solids will be the solids that are going to be copied around. Also, I do want to mention with Propagate, as with many of our commands, you can launch the command and then start choosing solids. Like in this case, our prompts say select the reference solid, which in this case will be the slab, and hit enter. And then what are our detail objects? Well, that's going to be the column. We can go from there. But also, I'm going to exit out of that. If I hover over my solid and I go to Propagate, it's assuming that that is my reference solid. So now it's just asking me for my detail solids. So sometimes the documentation is going to have you hover over something and then launch the command, and sometimes you're going to launch the command. So I just wanted to clear that up. So here are our detail objects. And again, as we saw previously, it zooms in. The blue is what is going to be copied. The purple area is that reference. Now, it also has a couple of options as to how this will be copied. We want to just do a plain copy. We're not going to copy it as a block. We just want a plain copy. And this will give us our suggestions from BricsCAD. It's analyzed where we could have this column copied to, and it's giving us some suggestions and also some additional information. As you hover over the check mark, you can see we've got BIM grid, we've got similar location, we've got grids. We want the BIM grid because we're working with BIM, and we actually want to explode this so we can manipulate each individual column. So we'll explode the grid, and now we can see we've got a check mark at every column there. Now for our grid, we only want the columns on the outside, so we can select all of these, click on them to get the red X to apply our selection set, and then we can apply the actual detail there. So now we just have the columns on the outside of the two long sides of the grid. All right, so that's the first piece. Next, we're actually going to create a truss. Now there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could use all of the different shapes in the steel and build it that way. But instead, we're going to just first create a line drawing. And then when we have the shape of the truss and all the spacing, then we'll go in and apply the different shapes, structural shapes. So a couple things that we want to make sure we've got some settings on is if we go to Structural MEP tab here in the ribbon, you want make sure that your display sides and ends is off. So there's no box around it. If there's a box highlighting that icon, that's on. We want that off, but we also want to turn on display axes, and that will show us our axes of the column. So you see that red line. And then there's one more settings. Let's go into the settings. So you can either type settings, or in this case, I have the Access 3D toolbar on, and that gives me quick access to settings, as well as some of the isolate, hide, and show, and also the prioritization of faces that we saw when we were working with Kim section. So we're going to go into settings, and in the search box, we can search for BIM OS mode, and that is the snapping mode. Let's see, let's zoom in a little bit here. We want to be sure that that access of linear solid, that first option, is checked on. All right, so to start drawing our truss, we really at this point only need the first two columns here. So let's go ahead and isolate them. And that would be under your select menu. And let's just turn that off. And let me turn that off, that can see that a little bit better. And we're just going to draw a line. Now, the reason we did some of those settings is going to help us with our snapping. So we're going to draw a line from the red line of that column axis, from one column to the next. So we just have a line. Now, we actually are going to move that line down. And to do that, I'll long left click to bring up the manipulator. And we'll click on the vertical bar here so we can move this line down a distance of 400 millimeters. we're going to draw another line from the midpoint of that line and go up 1400 and then come down to the top of the column again. So we have something that looks like a bit like a triangle. To be able to draw the members of the truss, we can use the divide command to divide that up. And we'll divide that top line into 10 segments, and the bottom line into 20. Now, one thing about the quad, if you haven't used the quad, you'll notice that once I execute a command, it will show up on this top line of my quad. Those are my most recently used commands. So typically my most recent command is going to be in that first slot. So we can do that. We're going to have 20 segments here. Now, don't worry if you're not seeing the division nodes there. We just need to turn them on. So I'm going to type in PD mode, put in a value of 32, and that will show you a circle for the node and gives it a kind of a good size. And now we can simply draw a line starting here at the endpoint of the bottom and basically connect the dots. And these will become the internal members of our truss. Ending at the bottom here. So we've got that. Now, actually, what we're going to do is mirror the lines and the top line and those diagonal lines of the truss. So I don't need those points anymore. So now I'm going to open up my structure browser. My structure browser is on the left. My other panels are on the right. Remember, Kin put all of his on the left. So again, you have quite a bit of control as to how you want to set up your workspace. But we're opening the structure browser, which the structure browser gives us a tree view of our drawing. And that gives me another way to search or find entities in my drawing. In this case, we can see all of the points. When you select something in the structure browser, it will highlight them in your drawing. And we don't need those points anymore. So I'm just going to hit the delete key, and now the points have been removed. And now we want to mirror this to the other side, actually copy and mirror it. So once we've selected all of those lines, again, a long left click brings up the manipulator, or you can access it from the quad. Now, generally, the manipulator will pop up kind of in the middle of where you're working. You can very easily move the manipulator to in this case, what I think is a better orientation by grabbing that little white ball and placing it here along the bottom chord at the midpoint. Now, don't worry if you don't like how the manipulator is oriented. By hitting the Shift key, we can change that orientation. So I prefer it this way. And now we can copy and mirror. By mirroring, we can hover, or actually we'll go ahead and click on the little arrow on the far right going horizontally. That tells me we're going into mirror mode. And then if you read your prompt at the command line, it says to enter a distance or copy. We want to copy, so we'll type C, and then I can either move my cursor over to that midpoint or just type 0, because our copy distance, we just wanted to mirror it right on its axis. And then hit enter, and now we've got our truss on both sides. So here's our truss. We don't need this line. It's actually 2 lines. So when you select that, we can just delete that. And now we've got our truss. So at this point, we're going to start to apply the different structural steel to it. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to do that. And then we've got a couple more steps, and then we'll take a break. So we've got our truss. When we've got our truss, and now we can start to apply the different shapes. And for that, we're going to use, let's see, what do we want to use here? We want the IPE 240. So in the search bar up here, you can just type IPE, select 240, and we want that on the bottom truss. So you're going to drag that into right on top of that line. And you can see that it starts to put the beam there. Now, again, like we did with the column, though, we want to rotate this. So again, hit Q to rotate that so it's facing out and hit enter. And we've got our truss. Now the top two beams are going to be this IPE 200. So you can select both of those lines and then drag and drop the beam right on top. And again, I think, yes, we need to do a quarter turn. So they're also facing out. For all the intermediate members, we'll do an IPN shape. We'll do an IPN 100. Now, this sometimes gets a little tricky here because you do want to go ahead and select all of these internal lines, just so you can see here. And then again, with that selection, using the IPN 100, drag and drop right onto one of the lines, Q for a quarter turn, and there we have our truss. So we've got our truss, and we can see when we hover over the bottom that it's already been classified as a beam. Our crossbars are classified as a member. That is correct. But our top two beams are actually classified as members, and they should be classified as beams. So again, we can manually select those, go to BIM, and classify manually. Classify manually looks like a little tag. And we can just select beam from our options here and hit OK. And now this is classified as a beam. Now at this point though, if I were to select that beam, we can see that we've got our beam solid and we have the line, because the line geometry still remains from when we created that truss. We don't need those lines anymore, so let's go back to the structure browser and delete the lines because we don't need them. They've served our purpose. Now I'm going to show all my entities. So we've got our one truss on the first two columns. As you might guess, we'll use Propagate to replicate this truss through the rest of our grid. So we can go from the quad or from the home tab on the ribbon, you can go to Propagate. Our reference solids will be the two front columns. Our detail objects will be the truss. Again, we'll copy it, just a plain copy. And BrooksCAD's going to go in and start to analyze where we could copy all of those trusses. Now, of course, as we expect, it would propagate across the top. It also says, well, we actually could put them on the bottom, but that's not what we want. So again, we will disable those suggestions and apply only the top. So now, in just a matter of seconds, we can see that we've got our trusses propagated throughout our model, which is, again, much quicker than we could have done manually, right? One more section and then we'll do a breakout. We're going to continue to add some bracing or sidebars on the side here. Now, again, I'm going to isolate or turn off the slab and the grid. So we can just turn that off. So we're just working here. We also want to change our BIM snapping mode and put that to 0. This will allow us to better snap just to the columns. And again, we'll go back to our BIM profiles. This time though, we want to use the UPN shapes. Now, if that doesn't show up, we might have to go to all of our standards, type in UPN, and this time we're going to use a 120, UPN 120. You also want to be sure that you've got your midpoint snap is turned on. And again, as I drag and drop this into my drawing, we can see that that shape is now on my cursor. We're going to snap to the outside midpoint of the column. And this is tricky. So you can see it's a little tricky, but we'll snap there. Again, make sure your ortho's on. So I'm going to hit F8. And as we come towards the second column, we can see that, again, this is rotated the wrong way. So we'll hit Q to do a quarter turn, actually twice, because we need it a half turn, really. And we'll also draw this to the midpoint of the outside face of the column. And then just hit enter. So we've got that brace there, but if we look closely, even though we snap to the outside face of the column, this crossbar is not really at the outside face. So we need to just shift that a little bit to the left. The way that we can do that is using eccentricity. So under the model tab, you'll find add eccentricity. And once you click on that, you'll get this series of arrows. We want to bump this to the left. So we're going to click on that left arrow, and you can see how that just bumped it out a little bit. Now make sure you hit accept. I always forget to hit accept. So make sure you hit accept to accept that. And now we have the first bar. We actually need 4 of these crossbars. So we're going to use the manipulator with my long click and click on that vertical line bar and place this up 1500 millimeters. Now don't dismiss the manipulator just quite yet, because we still need to use that for our copy. So again, click on that vertical bar, and down at our prompt line, we see a couple of options. We'll choose R to repeat. And we want this to be repeated at a value of 900 millimeters. And we want a total of 4. So as I move my cursor and I hit that 900 mark, you'll see that another crossbar is displayed for me. So once we see 4 bars, we're going to go ahead and click to accept that, and then hit escape to dismiss the manipulator. And we need these crossbars all along both the left side and the right side. So we'll use Propagate to do that again. So again, Propagate, and our reference solids will be the 2 columns. Our detail solids, what we're copying, are those crossbars. And hit OK. And again, we will do a plain copy. Now, as we've seen, and as Kin showed us too, there will be options with some of these suggestions. This one's a little tricky, because the only way that you can see what those options are would be to click them. Now we know that this looks good on this side, so I'm going to just select the arrow, the check marks here, and say apply. And we can see that we've now got those crossbars aligned as we want them. But when I come over to this side, if I click on option 1, or not even clicking, by default it's option 1, that crossbar is on the inside face of the column. We actually need it to be on the outside face. So if we take a look at another option, let's look at option 2. Now you see how it popped it over onto the outside face. So we actually need the outside face for this side. Now, for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure, this is not letting me choose all of these at once. So we'll just go ahead and manually click option 2 for all of these, and go ahead and apply the selections and apply the suggestions. And now we can see that these are on the right face of the column. So we always want them to be on the outside face of those columns, and that's what we've done.